I just got my first corona shot today, immunization vaccination thing. So I'm going to be more down to the topic and trying to focus a bit, and don't prolong it too much. I don't know. We'll see about that. It's very nice to see level design, and I think working on Atmora for a long time and level design, or I personally always feel a bit jealous when you have all this nice clutter in the forest and the lush bushes and everything. It's so beautiful. So really nice work in Momentum, I have to say. Beautiful. Yeah. So my plan was actually to jump in for Opus class lecture on shaders. However, he was planning to do some like live work on shaders and showing very specific experiments he was doing. And that's the thing. Usually we work with very specific shader sets, trying to basically convert our PBR into something that game player can work with and that looks good without losing quality, without causing crashes. However, what I can actually offer to you guys is basically a summary from many people I've been working with on shaders over the years, that we have kind of a basic introduction. So people who are new to 3D, or especially new to Nif, and especially new to Gamebryo engine, they might find it easier to look at some basic workflows and understand the basic reason, like why is it even a thing that we talk about these shaders here, since usually you just have PBR nowadays. So yeah. Can you see my picture and everything?
Yes, it's very clear to me.
Yes. Good. Yeah, so I wanted to say thank you to those people because they are like the main sources I was working with and who actually made me or helped me look into these shaders. And then I was doing some extended testing for specific shaders. And if you puzzle this together, you get a systematic understanding over the time. However, right now, I was working a bit with Multilayer Parallax and environment mapping, but I'm like not an expert into every detail of Nif magic. So when you specialize into these areas, you always find people and you always find direction. Then yeah, it's better you work your way into it. So my purpose now, or my goal, is that you have an overview, and it doesn't look as confusing. So I'm talking about the term shader types and what does it mean for us, where it's actually located in the Nif file. And then I'm going to show you the most important shader types used for Skyrim and other Creation Kit games. So the default type, the environmental specularity type, and the multilayer parallax and the glow shader. Then we have some exotic things to see, and finally, what makes a proper texture set, some words about textures, and I also want to scratch the surface on what you can do in general with Nif and what you do in this mesh, basically, because a lot of these properties are actually stored in that 3D file and not in the properties of the engine directly, like as if you would be in Unreal Engine or Unity. You could change mesh attributes and properties and rendering settings directly within the engine. Here we actually have it baked basically into our file, so we want to know how it works. Yeah, and that's going to be our roadmap for today. So you see that it's right between actually the concept art and the 3D art, and bringing your art concept to life, and then actually implementing it and making it real. So this is basically about tweaking the input signals we have, or the input properties, and we'll see that it is predefined how it's actually rendered and the output that is being generated. And most of you might know already that we have a very nice fan tool that was created, so we don't have to look at the meshes in Creation Kit or in the 3D tool. We can open it in kind of a preview, that's Nif Scope, and it's kind of reliable. But the thing to keep in mind is that since it's fan made and everything, there are specific shader settings and properties that do not show up clearly and properly. So the only real validation for whatever you do is that you render it and check it in game. Like I personally just put stuff in the QA smoke cell and teleport there and you compare stuff. So if you're interested into setting up this scope, I just left some links here and I'm gonna upload the presentation later so you can have a look. But for the most part, you also find a lot of people knowledgeable of this tool here right in Arcane University. Right. So also a word, if you set it up, you should load in your resources. Like you should basically tell the tool where your directory is located, so the textures show up properly. It's basically not an error if you just have pink or white surfaces at the start. You just need to tell the little tool that actually there is textures to show. So as I mentioned, if we look into basically Q&A, like qualities and fixes of our mods, we find that we have critical CDDs where we are thrown out of the game. This very often is caused by shaders that are not done correctly, by missing texture maps or wrong properties or some things that don't match. And this is something you can tweak only by basically changing the Nif itself and hit save and then just load it again the cell and check it in the engine. Also, if we are not able to understand how these textures are rendered in certain shader types, we'll probably not be able to show the full quality of our 3D game art. We're possibly not able to show the grains, the granularity, the structure, the surface type, the reflections, everything. So it's very important on this last bit to basically finalize all the effort that has been taken to bring this game art into life. And so we shouldn't, water it down at this point. So this is the motivation why this topic is important for us to understand, especially if we're new to Skyrim in 3D. But also, if you keep working on it and we want to make specific shaders, it's always a bit of experimenting. So the shader types are already predefined by the Nif format. So it is very easy to say that an overview there's about 10 to 15-ish, but we really only work with 2 or 3 at the end of the day. So we'll look into the default shader set because the default type is used for most meshes. And it is for rough surfaces and organic surfaces. You will see that, which are not as reflective. The environment map, which is for reflective surfaces like metal and ice and liquids. And we have a glow shader and we have multilayer parallaxing. And multilayer parallaxing is something which has a high degree of freedom, like a lot of experimenting, because you have several texture maps incorporated and more properties that must be hit correctly. So this is something you only see for advanced people doing. Like this is not the standard thing you need actually for most things, but it will make this basically fake depth of field, basically a fake depth of visual depthness. Like you have a second layer within your material, and you kind of look through it. And as you walk from the left to the right, you kind of rotate your view, and the inner and the outer structure move along. So this works very well with ice or crystal, basically. So you have an idea. I put these percentages in the front because it just tells you clearly how significant, how important default and environment map shaders are, and the others are more like a nice to have. And then beyond that, there are some tricks how to combine these and how these effects are being used together. So that's pretty, if you open a Nif object and you have never done so before, that's pretty scary. You still need to find first the structure and you need to understand where is the shader property set. I highlighted it in white. On the left, you have a fade node and as a root on the right side, a knee node. So what it says is basically on the left side, it is a static mesh, and on the right side, it is a rigged mesh. And so it's important to understand where are the shaders located. So I'll just quickly jump to the next one so you can see this. There's kind of a structure below that, behind that. You always have this root node on the top level, and it works like this is the parent node. And then you have always children nodes which inherit the properties. So on the elbow here, we have the nitri shape, which is basically the unit that consists the 3D information of the shape. So you can have as many nitri shapes as you want inside of a mesh. Let's say you have a barrel, so you can have the side elements and you have kind of the lid on the top. It could be 2 different nitri shapes and they could have different shader properties. However, what you cannot do is having this lid being at the same time kind of a metal material and a wood material, because those would go with different shaders. And one shape has to have one shader property. And so below that, there is for each nitri shape a specific texture set And this texture set contains levels of textures. And so every shader type needs specific textures applied and specific shader properties applied to render correctly. If this is screwed up, you will probably have a crash, or at least it doesn't look the way it was intended to look. So in the end of the day, if you are thinking about making a mesh that has as transparency as well as nice reflections and other attributes and maybe glowing, you could consider to combine several nitride shapes and blend them into each other. That's a trick often used by Bethesda, something we can quickly scratch the surface on later. However, you should not try to put all of this information, all of this shading information in the same shader, in the same shape, because that will crash. Like the game will not know what it has to render, basically. So the most important one, and this is really so commonly used that it's like literally every object you're looking at in Skyrim uses it. It's the default shader type and also the most simple one because it just has a basic color map, which is slot 1 in the texture set, the diffuse map, and a normal map for the height information. And as you can see, yeah, it's used on grass and all these things. So most of the things that Momentum just placed, basically, for a visual comparison to what we just saw. And you do have these flags that they require to render properly, like that it has actually shadows and that it basically can be mapped with a texture. These are basically also the export flags. If you have, for instance, the Nif tool in Blender and you export your mesh, you will set these flags. And then when it appears in the Nif, it will have these properties, but you can also change them inside a Nif file at any time. So I just threw an example here for you as a reference if you ever come back to this topic and you want to make this kind of shader and you're doing this the first time. On the left side, you see basically two stone textures. This is what a diffuse map looks like, and this is what a normal map looks like. And there's more to it. Like on the texture workflow, I will discuss a little bit how we get to these results because they are not directly relatable to the PBR output of modern 3D tools, contemporary 3D tools. However, you see it's relatively straightforward. And on the right side, you do have glossiness and specular color and specular strength. These are the properties, the shader properties that you have to set. So here it's important, and I think you have seen the online tutorials maybe, it is important to understand what is the scale. So glossiness goes from 0 to 999, for instance. 100 is a pretty low value, and it means that it's pretty glossy. However, if you go to the specular strength or environmental map strength on the other shader, then 1 is already the default value. It ranges basically from 0 to, I don't know, maybe 10, but usually you would never use something bigger as 5. So it really depends on what property you talk about, how it scales. And it is something you can find out by experimenting, but it's of course easier if you use a reference and then you check it visually in Nifscope and finally in the engine. Right. I'm already coming to the second most important shader type. I'm trying to be very concise here. This is the environmental specularity type, and as I mentioned earlier, it is for smooth and light reflecting surface patterns. So you find this on ice and chitin and glass armors and other things like that. And this one requires additionally an environmental or cube map and a material map or reflection map. So it will tell basically the engine how the light is thrown back off and how basically you have a directional specular color. So you also have additional shader flags to set. And here you must be very careful. If you have glow map enabled, it will just crash. Like this is one of these issues where the wrong properties will lead to crash the desktop. Right, so you know this infamous picture perhaps. If on the left side you see only a default shader, so this would be a dwarven armor just with default shader, and then if you add the reflection, the material on the middle, and if you add the cube map, you're on the right side, and you will see that it adds so much quality. It looks so much better. I also have another example for you here. That's ice. I made ice a while ago, 2 or 3 years ago with environmental map, and I really love this texture. And maybe you see the granular feeling, like the surface patterns, the height patterns there, the white stuff. That's in the specularity. So we'll come to the textures, but you see that actually you have height information not only in the normal map, but also in the normal map's alpha channel by how the light is thrown back at the spectator's eye. So this is an important bit and needs most tweaking here. An important bit of information. But just to have a look here, I just wanted to show you different shader types first, and then talk about in general about how we can achieve these textures. This is a kukri that Kettlewitch was working on, and in my personal opinion, this is really one of the best metallic colors I actually ever saw in game in Skyrim, because it really looks like a very shiny silver steel-like appearance in the game, but also has these dark edges and everything. So this will result in a beautiful iron sword, but you see that the default, the diffuse map is very dark, and the material map is pretty bright. And then basically your specularity color with all the metal color information comes by the shader properties. It does not come by the textures, and this is something we'll see. But it's something you wouldn't be used to, or you wouldn't see. Like if you look only at these textures, you can't tell how the actual knife, the actual blade looks like. Right. So if you ever come to have very dark default diffuse maps, you don't need to worry about. You really need to test it in the engine how it looks like. To complete the setup of the most important shader types, we have multilayer parallax, and here we did recently work on making nice eyes that basically has a fake inner depth. So you feel like you have transparency and you can look through, and you have patterns inside and outside, and they're not exactly the same. So there's a scaling between those. And what you need to be careful here is not only that you have surface tint and this cube map applied, but also you need to set the property controllers correctly. Like you have a layer thickness, you have a refraction scale, and a texture scale. And if for instance, this thickness is basically telling you how deep is my second layer of color information below my first surface layer. And if you put it too deep or too short below the first surface, you will not see it, essentially. So depending on the size of your mesh, you will have to go in game and make expand testing. So I did a design of experiment with a matrix and then an Excel basically, and I was running tests putting like 10 times 10 ice blocks next to each other in the world and loading multiple times the game and checking each of these values one by one and always changing only one parameter. So it took quite a while, but actually worked out. I really love this ice so much. I mean, I don't know. Must be because I was working on it more for a long time, but I love ice so much. It's really relieving me a lot when I see this. I know I've seen a lot of ice on the Nexus and in other mods, and I know there's a lot of green and blue, but I always wanted to have a realistic feel that it's kind of transparent, kind of white, but also having this nice blue tone in the darkness. You can't see it so much in this picture, but also a little bit greenish shimmer in the back. And of course, the surface structure is important. So yeah, you see what kind of texture maps I applied in this case, and it also took a while to make them actually look out by a lot of experimentation. And you see that we have a Skyrim set here where we also use multilayer parallax, and it just takes a while. So I really hope that if you're ever going to make this, the references you see on the left here, they might help you. So you know which shade effects to set and which values to go from. And then if you experiment, you hopefully don't need such a big amount of time to see results. Right. And this is a rather exotic one, the emission glow type. It will allow you to have static meshes that glow, like lanterns or glass windows, or I don't know, if you have monoliths that have structures on it, like say engravings and they're magical or something. So you will have a subsurface map that is giving you in a grayscale. It might give you color. And you will have the ShaderFlex 2, the glow map enabled. Else the shaders, the property controllers are the same as with the default shader set. So that would be looking like this, just as a reference, and like this, basically. So if you look into your arm again, like coming back with this human skeleton arm picture, below the BS lighting shader property, here on the left side as number 69, we have an additional object called Sliding Shader Property Float Controller. And they are usually used for controlling like particle effects or other things. And this time it's about the radiation that is going to be controlled by it. So you will have like a shader control variable for the emission, and you will have to experiment a little bit with this. And you can see if you just copy from a reference mesh or if you really need to change something, right? So, but also something to note is that the glow shader type's not the only way how Bethesda is making things shine in the game. Very often you have billboards that are being used or alpha textures. So objects are basically void, transparent, and then a color of the basic mesh is shining through. And then there are other methods. You can also use vertex painting to make things shine. So that's something to keep in mind. There's not only one method to achieve such a goal. It's like with transparency, basically there are 3 or 4 methods to do that. But it's important that you find the method that works for you and for your purpose. Right. And if you see other things like LED shapes and animated trees or face, skin, hair, that's not so important at this point, I think, because these are very special things. Just keep in mind that for an LED shape, you can only use default shader types. Anything else will not work. It will not render. Like I was trying to put, for instance, on a big iceberg, on a custom iceberg, our environmental shader for a few years ago, and you can just see the default way. And the way why you can see that from far away is because the colors will be rendered differently. So the color felt off. I was looking at distance and suddenly my glacier looks different because of the LED gap when it jumps from a normal static mesh to an LED mesh, which has lower detail. So you can see it from far, and it was rendering completely differently. So keep that in mind. Right. So all of these shader types use the same texture slots. And I think the real business is getting your textures correctly done. And for the most part, you will only need to be able to make a diffuse and the normal map correctly. As you remember, that was more than 80% of the meshes using those. And if you can do a cube map / environment map and a material map, slot 5 and 6, you'll be also fine for the other 15%. So you nearly have all of these shader types done. I just quickly made this chart to write down what they're being used for. So I just quickly go through diffuse and normal map because they're very important. Diffuse map is your base color map, and you have additional information into it. It's more than just a base color map. It's actually having some fake ambient occlusion and fake details and dirt and other things and crevices. And you will see that by the process coming from PBR, you need to add more detail and more information into this map because they compressed so much into information, so little textures back in the day to make their whole system more performant. And this is usually, it could be a transparent one, but it doesn't have to be transparent. So you can decide if you want to have an RGBA and an RGB. And you can use the transparency, obviously, like if you have a banner, for instance, then you have a slider and you can say, I want to have a cutoff at this value from 0 to 255, let's say 100. Then the more transparent areas will become invisible. So the banner can be looking very torn and aged, for instance. If you look at the normal map now, the alpha channel is not used for just looking through and being transparent. It's actually used for the information of the specularity. What you have seen on the ice when basically the light is coming back to you. It's giving you this visual fake hate information. So it's throwing the light back into your eye or somewhere else when you feel like there's a crevice or something, and maybe that there's a little engraving or something. So I think making these will already enable you to do most of the meshes rendered properly, which is why they're so important. I just made this a list of all the shader properties, shader flags for completeness, but we don't need to look at these. It's more like a reference if you ever look through what's this, what's that. You can have a look. Because I think this is really more the idea, the intention is that when any one of you ever wants to make shaders, they can go and look and read up what experiences did we currently have, and then we are going to also update this hopefully regularly. So this was the shader property controllers. You see that they're almost always the same no matter what shader type you use. And then when you have environment mapping, Then you have one additional slot for the environment map scale, that basically gives you the strength. And for multilayer parallax, you have 4 more slots. But basically, it's always the same properties. So even though this might look very confusing, it's actually quite efficient because you always talk about the same things. So alpha and refraction is both about transparency. Glossiness, we already had. That is basically about how light is shining back from the mesh. You can set the specular color, which is interesting, especially if you have metals. So you want to get the red, green, and blue values. You can get them originally even from websites. Like you have websites where they give you these colors. What's the natural values for iron or for bronze, for instance. And specular strength is also how it's actually reflected into the eye, this specific color. Yeah. And there isn't so much deviation with the lighting effect 1 and 2 in the vanilla files. So it's most of the time just the same the way it is. So it's common to see specular strength ranging from 0.5 to 5 perhaps, but it's very uncommon that you see meshes with different lighting effect levels than 0, 3, and 2. Right. So this is a very simplified workflow to making a diffuse map as the basic layer of color information from an albedo map. You basically just need to see how things are blend into each other. You have layers in your 2D tool, and this is basically assuming that you could either use your 3D tool, like nowadays most people do, and stack them with nodes together, or you do that in a classic way, like with GIMP or Photoshop in a 2D tool, and then you blend these layers on top of each other. So you assume that you always start with the PBR maps that you have, and then you stack them over each other, blending them into each other to convey the visual information that you want to have in your shader. However, I don't see the value in going through each of these because there's actually a few of these workthrough suggestions. I would just leave them as a suggestion or as basically as a red line for those who want to follow those paths and try it out. And I think that would be sufficient. If you're more into PBR, you know that there's 2 different settings, like 2 different types of PBR texture sets. You have the metal roughness oriented ones and the specular gloss ones. And you can convert both of them back into GameBrew Nif format. However, color information and specularities are handled differently, so you will have to convert them, of course. Right. So this is a specific workflow. If you have metal roughness PBR and you want to make Skyrim textures, you want to make a fuse, a normal, a specularity, and an environment, because you use an environmental map. That was the second shader type I was discussing, the 15% one for a metal. And so those are basically the textures you need. Here you can see on the bottom right, it's in slot 1, 2, and 5, and 6. And so there is a tool to get a cavity map in that case. And I really want to say thank you to Catalyst because yeah, we've been working. This is actually very much his method. Like the first method was more something that I did, and this is something he did. So the credit goes to him. And you can basically, I don't know if you're interested into this or if you want to go through step by step, but I think it's important that you have an address that you can look it up. And if you, yeah, if you want to go through this workflow, then you can. I don't want to decide which workflow is the best for you. I think it's something that you need to do with experimenting. This one is already a little bit more elaborate. So I just quickly wrote down in a short note which layers are used to convey this information. And that short note here is that whenever we talk about clamps and color levels, it's basically the shape, the slider from black to white. So it's about adjusting, like in your picture, you have information, and this level of information is between 0 and 255, and you want to sometimes cut out empty areas. So all your contrast is within your field of view, basically. So in this case, we just cut off a little bit white on the white edge and make the overall picture more bright-ish, right? Yeah, I think these things come very nice if you just work on an example from start to finish, but I think that would completely break the timeline. it's important to know that you want to use additional information on the diffuse map, that you want to have additional crevices and basically like ambient occlusion fake layers, and you want to have a little bit more of surface information that you usually don't have on a basic color map. And it's important to remember that the environment map, like is basically your global gloss map. So, and your normal map also has a specularity in the alpha channel. I think if I talk with you about each detail, I don't know. So at this point, this is what I mentioned before. There's websites where you can just look for the red, green, and blue values for each material. So you can make sure, for instance, that your metallic shine is set correctly. And you can just double click in specular color, what appears to be a white bar right now. And then there you have 3 boxes with numbers, so you can edit them. Right. Then there's also a way to make a local gloss map. So you have locally different specularity. And that's something to use when you have basically 2 different metallic materials. So you would go and basically make the whole workflow that I just showed before, make it a little bit more deeper and elaborate on these local gloss maps. So what it would look like is basically this. You will have gold in this example and ebony, which is also work of Kettlewitch. And I just wanted to mention that this path exists, that it's possible to do it that way. Here, you know, there's 2 different shader types. So basically, there's 2 different shader properties because you want your gold to reflect in a different way than your iron did, or your ebony in that case. So what you have to do is basically either you completely separate the 3D shapes from each other, so you can set the shaders completely independently from each other, or you just duplicate the mesh and then you use an alpha on one side, because the alpha will blend out basically the ebony on the right side here, so you only have the gold left. And then you can focus with all your shader properties just to tweak the appearance of the gold one. And then you have to put them back into each other and make sure there's no Z-fighting, because there's blending modes. Z-fighting is when you have 2 objects laying on the same height level. So it would be like on-off, showing you once the ebony, once the gold, once the ebony, once the gold. Maybe you have seen this in level design if you have a door and the hallway is not attached properly, and then you have this flickering thing, or the ground, if 2 things are on the same height. So this is Z-fighting, and you really want to avoid that. And so you can basically blend them into each other. There are blending modes, how you can blend nitrous shapes into each other. And this is how you basically avoid this issue. But the best way would be to have 2 completely separate meshes that you can put on top of each other with very specific height levels. Right. For the root node level, just a little short note on Nifs, that there's actually, like, there's all these numbers and they come with specific attributes that are important to do specific things, like head up and rectangle and so forth. If you come to work with Nifs, I just wanted to basically scratch the surface. You see where the shader is, you see where the texture set is, you know what kind of shaders it is, and so you can tweak it and work with it. But you will find out that on the root node already, you have other things, like you have basically the physical material, like can it swim, can it not swim, what kind of impact sound does it have, and where's the weight center, basically. So if you throw a figure or if you throw an axe on a table, where will it bend to? How will it fall down? These things, and the collision and so forth. All of these things are in the root node, which is at the top. And so like the fade node, like the basic specs, and the inventory marker, how it's rotated when you look at it in the inventory. But this is already advanced stuff for the Nif format, which could actually be a totally separate thing to talk about because it goes way deeper than that. What's really important for me is that we know that we cannot straight away copy PBR textures, and that we know what kind of shaders we're working with and how we achieve texture maps that work and convey all our details and don't lead to crashes. So you can do much more cool stuff with Nifscope format. You can actually like weathers are created that way, that you have effects going on. You have effect nodes, and you have particle systems like dust or something, and throwing smoke. You have light effects. You have the skybox with the moon and everything. It's also on the map if you open the minimap. You can use planes like this rotating, for instance, like you have water or you have lava, and then we made a volcano plume. So it would rotate and would basically change the texture all the time with a very controlled flow with a Nif float interpolator. And it also has textures, of course. So you see there's a BS effect shader property, and if you go deeper, you also find textures. So the basic functionality is the same. And also you have this kind of doors that open, scrolls you can read. Or you have here this ice. This is DLC 1 ice, where the dragon comes up from the water and just ambushes the player. So there's a lot of cool things you can do with Nif format. You just have to watch a few tutorials there and see what other people do here. Just as a small motivation for you that this is actually an interesting topic, and the whole shaders topic is just like an intro to get into the whole Nif format. You have to know the basics of the structure, and then once you know it, it's actually very tempting to look deeper and actually animate your mesh or do something crazy with it, have special effects at it and so forth, do lightning, thunder, and things like that, which will make very, very interesting assets once they are in the world. So yeah, I hope you found this interesting, and I think I was pretty much on time here. And just for curiosity, I saw that today I saw that if you use clairvoyance, it will reveal who was the bad guy you're gonna have to slay in this quest with the Dark Brotherhood. I thought that was kind of the information I wanted to give you at the end. Anyways, yeah, thank you very much. And I think now we could talk about questions if you'd like.
The first thing that comes to mind is, have you seen examples in Skyrim or any Elder Scrolls game that stick out to you? Or how often do you see shaders implemented incorrectly?
Oh yeah. Well, if you download mods or even in vanilla, you have that, if you load creation kit and it loads automatically all the cells and you run through, you can make this editor warnings export, and then you copy paste this basically from a text pad or text file into an Excel chart. And you can tell that there's a lot of things that go wrong. Like usually there was this line 806 issue with vertex colors and so forth. Um, there are many, many, many things that are non-critical, but if you really, let's say you have Multilayer Parallax and you use the wrong texture maps, it will crash. Or you have glow map as shader flag set on, then it will just crash. So this happens, and for the most part, it is the most frequent reason for crash to desktop. Like if you test the mod and you have custom assets somewhere and it's crashing, it's always the first thing I'd look at is there a custom mesh and we oversaw just a single flag, a single check mark, a single texture that might have not enough channels. Like maybe there's an RGBA and the alpha channel is just not exported. It was just exported as RGB. Such things can lead to crashes, and I've seen this quite often. However, we set up some rules in our team so we could avoid this. Like we already a few years old, but we made a list with hints how to make meshes and level design and other things to avoid the most frequently occurring bugs. And it became better. So yeah, thinking about the vanilla game, I know that the unofficial Skyrim patch does quite fix a few. Like Argo does fix a few with them. That's pretty appreciated. Yeah.
I had
Yeah.
a question
I think
for
we are
others.
lucky if we don't encounter too many. Yeah.
When you're doing things like ice, things that are supposed to be transparent, like almost like slightly transparent, I guess, what are the biggest challenges when it comes to making shaders with that?
Okay, so specifically I mean, the environment, I was very happy with the environmental eyes here, with the environmental specularity type, and also took a few weeks actually to get it the way was supposed to be. You're sitting with a lot of people, or basically with a group of people, and everyone has their ideas. So I had a guy who was making eyes on Nexus, and he was pretty cool. And I talked with him, but he would always come with very bluish, very greenish eyes. Like even if you looked into vanilla Skyrim, you do have one DLC has green eyes and the other one has blue eyes, and it's not visually compatible at all. So you sit down and think, what shall we do? And it takes a lot of experimenting. This one is solely reflective, but you don't notice that because the color is bright. The Multilayer Parallax, it appeared to be black first, which is funny. If you don't hit the layer thickness and the inner scale correctly, you don't have this multilayer parallax effect at all. So for the most part, I was sitting there and testing and testing and testing and testing. And after, after a few weeks, or maybe it was even 2 months, I don't know, it just finally blobbed and it worked. And I could saw that when I was running from left to the right, there was some emission and some change of the different levels between each other. Like they would no longer be one-to-one. There would be a movement between them visually, because if you walk, like there's this visual line between your eye and the inner surface and the outer surface, and there's a shift between these two, which gives you this fake feeling of transparency, that you look into a structure and then there's inner structures that don't move when the outer structure moves towards your eye, basically. And I have downloaded, for instance, also once I've downloaded this Atmora Multilayer Parallax thing, but it was a very infamous Nexus mod, but it didn't work for me. I don't know. I was you need a lot of experimenting with those, and also the shader properties. It's something where you need to be patient enough to write down what you saw very, very accurately and repeat the process a few times, and then you will eventually have the visual results you want to have. But I understand that this kind of thing, if you quickly want to load a modern Nexus, it's not something you would like to do. Like you wouldn't want to sit down and talk about shaders for 2 months. So yeah, it's basically something you. But now, I mean, this is also the curve, the learning curve that you have. So if you have a direct introduction into this and you already can take these references, and this is also why I said thank you to all these other people. It doesn't seem like much, but all of these people have done something unique about this, about shaders, about the texture format, about the whole workflow of getting these textures done, because we didn't know how Bethesda was creating these. I mean, they also, I don't think, admittedly, they used tools of contemporary tools, because they made the game like 2005 to 2011 or something. But yeah, in the end, I just want to say we have been very lucky that we could accumulate all these little different pieces of the mosaic, and now I'm trying to make a whole of it and make it available to everyone, so they don't have to sit down for such a long time to get comparable results for their 3D work, basically.
We have a question in the channel. You spoke to this a little. Stratigraphy says, you spoke to this a little, and I'm afraid I missed the beginning of the lecture in case you spoke of it then. But what are the major differences between using a 2D tool like GIMP or Photoshop versus a 3D tool, I'm assuming in relation to shaders? What should we consider in choosing which to use? I think he means like a 3D tool like Substance Painter. Is that right?
Okay. Yeah, I think I understand the question. And the blunt answer is there's no difference, which sounds strange, because you would say that even modern engines like Unity or Unreal, but also like Blend and Maya and all of them, in the end, they do the same thing that you do manually if you use GIMP or Photoshop, or if you use an automatic texture conversion tool. Like there are some automatic texture conversion tools, but of course they're not specified for Skyrim. However, if you're crazy about it, you could script it. Like you could program it that all of this happens automatically, but I would not suggest to do so, because there's a high variance of the outcome. Yeah, like Gamo maybe also might tell you There's this suggestion from Kettleridge how he exactly will go about certain types of maps, translate them into Skyrim from PBR. However, it doesn't always work. And even if you look into the work of Bethesda, they have a huge variety. I mean, I just mentioned the different colors of the ice, but also the difference of the textures, like the roughness and the surface. Actually, if you look close, it's not such a consistency. Anyways, the point is that you would usually just go and have different layers stacked on top of each other, and you would blend them into each other. Now, you can either do this by just having the layers in the 3D tool, 2D tool, sorry, GIMP or Photoshop, or you can do this in 3D when you connect them to each other. So if you connect them in the 3D tool, you have the nodes. Also in contemporary engines like Unreal or Unity, you can just have these little boxes, little icons, little objects, and then you can connect these little lines, the spaghetti, basically, spaghetti code like. And but it will do the same thing, like as if you load them as visual surfaces in GIMP or Photoshop and just add them on top, stack them on top of each other. So in the end, I mean, it's more straightforward if you're a 3D artist anyways, that you learn how this works in a 3D tool, because the basic idea. But it's clearer for you visually if you come from 2D actually. And I also did this mostly for 2D because if you really spend a few months hand painting textures and then applying the different levels of information on top of each other, you have a stomach feeling for where you want to go with the texture and what's missing. You don't have a stomach feeling if you just work with the nodes. So it becomes an abstract knowledge. So I think it's good to have this deeper, let's say, informal understanding beyond being able to do the same virtually in a 3D tool. So I see an advantage. Of course, also if you make a mesh in 3D, it might be easier to use a few tricks. You can load in pre-built textures. You can basically also paint your mesh on the 3D one. Like if you do everything completely on 2D, the hard part would be that you basically have to copy a wireframe for your UV map in. And this is like they worked like 10 or 15 years ago. It would be more work because you have to imagine how stuff is wrapped up and test and go back and test and go back. So you go from 2D tool to 3D tool, from 3D tool to 3D tool. Obviously, then for that part, it's easier if you really just paint and you don't do the tiling texture, but a unique texture, like unique to certain areas of the UV map. It's much easier to go into your 3D tool because you can directly paint the teeth on a monster or something, and you see, there's the end of the teeth, like give it a yellow edge or something. And in looking at a plain 2D surface, it wouldn't be that easy, even though you have the wireframe additionally. However, if it's really, if you just have already painted textures, or you just export them from PBR, you already have these layers, and it's just about converting them. I would say that it's more straightforward in a 2D tool because you see everything on the main screen and you can, yeah, it might be easier to follow visually, perhaps, and not be confused with other things that happen around you. Yeah. So my answer is that you could use both directions. You could use 2D tools and 3D tools, and I don't think anyone is still painting unique tools completely with 2D. I think they all start with 3D maps and just convert them. And for that purpose, it's absolutely fine. Also, if you have a mesh that is very flat and is predefined, like let's say you have a vanilla mesh and you just paint over, or you have like a banner or something, even if it has an unconventional shape, you know exactly what information is in what point of the texture. So you would probably be okay with just painting it. But if you have like a tiger or something, or bear or something in 3D, and I don't know, you're in the armpits or somewhere, it might happen that you don't have a good idea where your curves are, or a hawk or something, how it's actually put on top of the mesh. So how it's unwrapped basically. Yeah. I really appreciate it that you're interested in this topic and that you want to move forward. It's cool.